All right, I'm going to be getting started here in just a minute. Just want to
Great. I
make
started
sure
the
that,
recording.
can I get a thumbs up that you guys are able to hear me and that you're able to see my screen here?
Yes, we can.
All right. Good deal. All right, I'm going to jump right in here. Thanks for joining today's call. We are going to take everybody through a data center migration and how that traditionally plays out here at 3Cloud and for our customers, and some of the considerations as we look to embark on a data center migration. What are the things that we need to consider as we get in? So with that said, I'm going to jump into our agenda for the day, which is going to be covering really kind of just high level, obviously aligned to Microsoft's Cloud Adoption Framework, the CAF, and wanted to quickly walk through that, what that is for anybody that's not familiar with it. It's pretty mainstream at this point, so that should be a little bit of a review for most. Then we're going to get into strategy and planning, and then we're going to get into discovery and assessment. We'll then talk about migrate and optimize, right? And those phases of the project and what that means and what are the activities that traditionally take place during that time. The last item here that we'll go through is really around Azure Migrate and what it is, what it's capable of. And I'll give a quick little demo at the end just so that we're all on the same page. And then from there, we'll kind of take questions. And if anybody wants to put questions in chat as we go, I'll look to get to those at the tail end of this presentation. But thanks again, everybody, for joining. Let's get this thing underway. So when we're thinking about a data center migration, Microsoft's got a very kind of well thought out, high level framework that we adhere to as a gold partner of Microsoft's. It covers the foundational pieces of really planning and setting the path for your migration in a way that's going to, number one, lay out a strong strategy that's going to align to, understanding the business requirements, outcomes, and some of the justification for the move. From there, we get into really kind of planning, right, and identifying the different types of workloads and really just organizationally aligning to what's going to be needed in order to have a successful migration that minimizes risk for the organization, right? We don't want to disrupt service. We don't want to take down any kind of line of business applications that may be required for the business to operate. And so working around some of putting together that detailed plan and strategy around the various workloads and planning for that is really important for us to measure twice, cut once. From there, we get into what Microsoft references as the ready phase of this, where we're building out traditionally an Azure foundation, along with some other foundational pieces as it pertains to governance, standards, security. Some of those, it's referenced as a landing zone, it's referenced as a foundation. Those are kind of used interchangeably, but the concept is really building out let's call it an environment within the cloud that's going to meet business requirements, almost your virtual data center, if you will, that accompanies all of the different types of Azure resources that we may need to incorporate to make sure that we're ready for prime time when it comes to migration time. In that pink box, we've got adopt, right? This is where we get into the migrate and we actually move the workloads over, depending on the approach. We'll get into some of that as a part of this conversation. We want to follow best practices and use some of the native Azure tools as a part of making sure that we're aligning to the standards and the recommendations that the platform can flag as a part of some of its advisory services in a way that's going to really ensure that we're meeting our mark with expectations around, what's configured, how's it done, are we following best practices? We don't want to just move something over into the environment without it being in, a tightly managed space, especially with all of the security threats and ransomware and various things that have really hit the mainstream, even as of this week. So As we look at that, we also look at ways to innovate, right? What are we doing in a current state, which is maybe in an IaaS fashion, that we could be driving towards something that's more cloud native, and it's going to lower our operational requirements and overhead there with regards to management and maintenance of those guest OSs that we no longer have, if we can get over to something that's more cloud native. And then from there, we transition to govern and manage. As it's laid out here, I mean, this is really just identifying how we're monitoring, managing, and really driving to best practices and maturing the cloud model that's going to enable the organization on its journey as it continues down this path. So jumping right into some of the questions that we need to drive into that are critical to our success. What are the business drivers and motivators for a cloud migration? Many times when we get in this discussion with our customers, it's really around, is it a time game and they need to move fast because they've got expiring contracts, they've got sunsetting hardware, they've got different drivers or motivators for maybe even specific business units that they need to get out to the cloud? Is it we're actually not pressured to move, but we'd like to take advantage of all of the cloud capabilities and maybe operate in a hybrid state for an extended period of time? What does that look like? And maybe we're taking that cloud first approach that you guys have probably all heard at this point, where we're building anything net new in a cloud native fashion that is optimized and really designed and architected for the cloud, and taking advantage of best practices there. Understanding those motivators really help drive the timeline and some of the key decisions that we have to make around, the actual impact to our migration. So if we know that our timeline and that next question, how long do I have to move the targeted workloads, is only 3 months, then I'm likely going to have to take a lift and shift approach, where I'm going to have to forklift those systems as is into Azure without making too many changes to them. We just need to get them over. If we've got more time and the duration is longer, and really the organization is willing to make an investment in that, as we'll get into some of these other conversations here, we may want to rethink how we do that, because that can, a little extra, let's call it development work now, can really save us a lot of operational cost in the future. So that gets to the next question, which is really around strategic application to the business. Is this application a strategic application, right? Is it a line of business application that we're going to keep around for a while and that our business thrives on and lives on? Is this a legacy app that we're actually we've only got a couple more months or a year left on it that we're going to sunset? Understanding that lets us know if we're going to actually make an investment into some of those next steps around that application that may drive the actual direction of our migration. If it's something that we're going to sunset, let's just get it over there for right now, and then we'll as long as it's supportable on the cloud, we'll get rid of that at a later date, and that will be something that we won't make a big investment in from a re-architecture, rethinking the way that it's currently set up, so that we can make the right decisions as a part of this planning process. The cost justification and TCO to modernize versus migrate is something that we've got some formulas here at 3Cloud that we walk our customers through, but the concept's fairly simple. It really comes down to exactly what I just laid out. The willingness of the business to make an investment in the application, to lower, and if they've got ultimately the budget, which is our next question, to make that investment. By making an investment in optimizing and modernizing that application from where it is today to where it could be in the cloud, will save on operational time. So there is a total cost of ownership formula that we can run based off of, all right, it's going to take, based off of the complexity of the app, it's going to take X amount of time to modernize, which is going to cost you X. In that time, if we think about all the patching, we think about all of the other upkeep and whatnot, there's going to be X amount of cost that's associated with that IaaS infrastructure. And if we can shed some of that IaaS infrastructure and move to PaaS native services, the actual runtime on that in the cloud is going to be less expensive than moving it as is over the lifetime of its life cycle. So understanding the budget for the migration also dictates maybe some of the direction that we look as we're guiding our customers through a migration. So moving right along, Some of the obvious, a lot of organizations have gone through this process, or at least have heard about the 7 Rs. Sometimes it's 5 Rs, depends on who you talk to. We've got it at 7 Rs, right? We've got the rehost is that lift and shift approach, not making any code changes. You're bringing it as is. You're setting up the network so that then it's moving now to the new location within Azure, and it's a lot less dev work, right? It's the quick move to get there, take advantage of some of those services, and to make sure that your workloads are staying collectively together as a group. The other, some of these other ones that highlight are refactor. There's really no code changes to a refactor. This is really seeing and evaluating what you've got within your stack or your digital estate and saying, all right, that custom code is easy to port over to maybe a web app or an app service plan that then requires really little to no change from our standpoint, that we can modernize to cloud native services that are actually going to save us costs. So let's do it, right? And it starts to shift kind of as you go from red to blue to green. You're now moving from IaaS to more PaaS focused kind of implementations. And as we look at architect, I mean, we're talking about a rewrite of code to, kind of work within the modern estate of the cloud. And so those are tuning and tweaking and really needing to make code changes in order to maybe have your authentication go to Azure AD, maybe make your databases so that they're cleaned up and so that there's not cross database queries that are going to create issues with some of those SQL PaaS services, making changes to those configurations in a way that's going to essentially re-architect and realign to what the cloud can provide, that still gives you the benefit of those PaaS services from a minimized operational overhead perspective. Rebuild, we're getting into obviously the rewrite of applications and really kind of driving towards something that aligns to PaaS and PaaS services. And this, in certain regards can be a rewrite of your application and doing this in a way that obviously requires more effort, right? And so if we look in this pendulum of low effort to make it happen in timeline versus as we start to swing out to going down these PaaS services, what I've got with that asterisk is it's going to require more development effort to get there. And if we're willing to make that investment now and we see that the TCO is worth it because we're going to keep this application around for a while, let's do it. Let's make that change and let's make things easier on our organization to really operate and take advantage of the full suite of the cloud. Some of these other ones to call out, right? Replace is something where we look at organization says we've got application A, and if I look at the SaaS solution, it covers 95% of what I need. I'm okay with losing that 5% to have somebody else manage this. That's the replace scenario. We've also got retain and retire on here. Retain, if you think about that, those are maybe some of the anchors that need to be kept on-prem that can't go to the cloud, right? Maybe it's infrastructure that supports something local to where the business operates. Maybe it's a mainframe. Maybe it's something that's legacy that we can't really move because it's not compatible. Those are things that end up staying on-prem if we're going to keep that around. If we're vacating a data center, we've got to figure out a game plan for those services or a replacement for them in the cloud if we're completely veering away from needing that colo at all. As we look at retire, it's sunsetting legacy services. What can we get rid of, right? That is an important part of this equation as we get into our data center migrations. So moving right along, as we look at building out a successful team that's going to enable a migration, we want to build the A team. We want to make sure we've got the right players at the right place at the right time. And it's a combination of not just technical folks. It's really important to make sure that the business is a part and aware of what's going on. We've seen circumstances where when communication is dropped from the various telephone games that take place within a large organization and services go offline, that produces bad outcomes for not only the end user, but ultimately the organization as a whole. That as a 3Cloud partner, we really guide our customers on making sure that they've got a strong communication plan to make sure that we're adhering to change advisory requirement, change advisory board alignment to the change request process, right? So those are important parts for us. We need to make sure that there's a business stakeholder that's vested in this We want to make sure that there's business analysts and power users that are able to help us when it comes to smoke testing and really vetting the systems that the organization is going to be a lot more familiar with. We want to have strong project managers aligned both on the, on our side from a delivery standpoint, but also for the internal organization, as the project manager is going to be key in really playing air traffic control and what ends up being a very busy operational process to getting to a migration. As far as the technical folks, I don't think any of these should look new to anybody that's maybe tightly aligned with IT. Architects, engineers, developers, DevOps, database administrators, those are some of the key roles. Network architects also fall within here. That are some of the, kind of as we get into some of the finer skill sets here, those are, opportunities for us to make sure that we've got the right people, the right butts in seats that are going to help us have success with our migration. So as we look at kind of the recommended technical skills, obviously any Azure experience is highly recommended. There's many ways to skill up. There's many ways to get online training. It's becoming something that I think more and more of the customers that we engage with are already in Azure as we're meeting them on their journey. And so we're finding more people with more skill sets that are looking to press the envelope on not just coming in at the novice entry level, but more of that advanced, like, how can I really use this to accelerate my organization in the right direction, and in the pivot of skill sets from the traditional silos that we traditionally have, whether that be storage, compute, or whatever within an organization, is now coming together in a way, because these services are available in a way that are easy to be consumed, that really you're becoming more strategic to the organization as you look to skill up and really take your career to the next level, which the cloud provides some awesome opportunity for. So that's been fun to watch as a partner. So pivoting into the workload discovery and assessment, here are some of the things that we drive towards, right? What is the workload that we're migrating? Do we have a detailed inventory of it, right? Some of the first steps that we take as a part of this process, if you're not a partner of Microsoft's, we can leverage Azure Migrate, which is a free service that's part of Azure. That is a great way to inventory, and we'll get into some of that a little bit later, as to the capabilities of how it's going to help us understand what's in our digital estate. But other solutions or other tools like Movera, that's got advanced capabilities and something that Microsoft acquired years ago that has been used for as long as I've been doing these assessments, which is a fairly long time. One of the key items here is that it allows us to gather metrics and information on, what's in our estate, what is the alignment to the applications and the workloads that sit on them. Is this a line of business app? Is this a COTS app, something that custom off the shelf app that we don't really have any control of changing too much of the code unless we work with the vendor on? Is this supporting infrastructure, right? We need to get into some level of classification of that. That's going to help us, and we need to document it so that everybody knows what we're working on and what's going to be a part of those waves as we structure those. What is the performance on these workloads is really key. We're working with high performant databases or high churn workloads. We need to have an idea of what those peaks are. And when we talk about Arc99, that's something that Movera as well as Azure Migrate aligned to. Arc99 really is giving us a actual realized consumption of 99%, and this allows us to right size the environment to what is actually going to be what we need to provision to, right? So if you're looking at this, maybe in the on-prem environment, we over-provisioned a lot of resources because we already bought the hardware and it's there and it's not costing us anything more to over-provision, and it's nice to have that extra performance. Well, in the cloud, that's going to save us money if we get that closer to the pin of what it needs to be. When we talk about high churn and high performance metrics, that's critical in understanding early on where the alignment is and where we need to build to with regards to the specification. I've worked with some fairly large SAP databases that have had ridiculous requirements, and they were pushing the boundaries on some of the standard Microsoft offerings. I mean, we're talking about servers with 2 terabytes of RAM, and the specs continue to grow. But we bumped up against some thresholds as they threw more hardware at it to fix some of the performance issues that they had over time. And so we need to make sure that we're accounting for that in our planning process and as we get into our discovery. What are the workload dependencies is really important as we look at introducing physics if we're operating in a hybrid state. If we're looking at database replication between primary site, maybe on-prem, and primary Azure site in the cloud, if there's cross-database calls being made or there's certain transactions that are taking place, even if it's database replication, we need to think about how maybe we're batch processing jobs and sending that to and from, as that can impact ultimately performance of response time and other things that users at the end of the day may pick up on as a part of what that latency looks like. So really understanding the dependencies is going to help give us better visibility into what needs to go together, right? How are we creating a plan that is going to incorporate groups of workloads that are all talking to each other so that we've got less of that physics play that I'm talking about that we would introduce if we leave one behind. So there's ways to gain visibility into that. One of those being Azure Migrate, another being Mover. It's running a netstat-a essentially, and we're getting port traffic and also the services that are communicating on those ports. It's also very important for obviously some of the zero trust components of this, of having something documented. And we want to make sure we capture that over time, right? There may be calls and such that take place at different times of the month, different times of the day, that we've got to let that run for some time to gather the information. The last question on here is, what is the app value to the business? Having a calibration of what that is helps us determine the priority of the migration, helps us understand where and if we even need to move it. Those are important things that we need to drive into as we get into our discovery. One of the things that we'll do from a 3Cloud perspective is we get into some assessments where we get into weighing in a kind of workload assessment per workload, right? So if we look at this, we've got kind of, is the application a good technical fit for the cloud? And what kind of level of effort is it going to take to actually move it, right? A couple examples here. A1, for example, is a custom written application that is a very large application with a lot of integrations that adds a ton of business value to move it out into the cloud. But as far as the fit and the level of effort that it would take to move that in its current state, we've got that further down in the bottom right-hand quadrant, which isn't necessarily an easy win for us. And so as we're shaping up our migration path, we want to identify what those quick wins are and what are good targets. And so we put together a little bit of a weighted scale that is going to have, the size of the app as well as kind of the feasibility of the move, to put together a game plan that prioritizes some of those workloads that kind of, let's call it, distill up to the top, that are good quick wins that are going to show value for the business, so that we can also gain some confidence in our ability to make those migrations happen. As we get into the workload assessment piece of this, we need to ask ourselves, can the workload be moved to Azure? I know that it kind of sounds crazy in today's day and age, but there's a lot of systems that are out there today. Mainframes are a perfect example of something that, while Microsoft's creating capabilities to move certain types of mainframes to Azure, there's some old hardware out there. There's things that exist within some of the digital estates that we've seen that just don't move, right? Unix systems, compatibility with certain operating systems that don't run on Azure, so you're not going to be able to lift and forklift them over. Having a good identity of what those things are and how they're being used is really important. I would say, even from a networking perspective, what are all the different types of solutions that are out there that are being used today? Are they appliance-based? Some of those things don't just carry over in a lift and shift model. Do we need to find a comparable solution that's maybe in the marketplace that we can align to? Those are important things that we need to do our due diligence on, and ask some of those questions of, does it have a dongle on it that's going to prevent us from moving it, right? those are the kinds of things that we need to get into. What kind of hard-coded IPs might be within this configuration that I need to be aware of before we get into this? And some of that is going to come through discovery with our customer and really driving into the details of what's within the environment. So, as we look at this and we get into the assessing, right, we've got that Movera data that we captured in that last discovery phase, that now we can start to align the right sizing of the environment based off of the peak over time, right? So really important that we're driving towards optimizing this, as we don't want to necessarily bring this environment exactly as it is, because that can be expensive. So we want to find opportunities where we can properly align the stars there. Grouping workloads together, I mentioned this earlier, as they have dependencies on each other, we want to make sure that we're capturing that port traffic, and there's ways to do that. I'll share one of those towards the end of this as we get into the Azure Migrate and some of the queries, the KQL queries that we can run to gather that. But as we get into the details, it's good to have a baseline of what actually talks to what, so that the team can review that prior to migration. This, as I mentioned earlier, is becoming more and more important as people drive towards zero trust. Knowing what's talking to what is key to having success. What are standard ports, right? Active Directory ports versus maybe application specific, and how are we making sure that we're locking those down, right? And everything that we're setting up is intentional. Those kinds of things can help us avoid any kind of security compromises, and do it in a way it's very responsible as a part of the migration as well. So, as far as aligning kind of the target of where we're driving to, I think that some of the earlier conversations that we framed up with regards to the organizational approach of, we're only doing PaaS services. Okay, well, we know what our targeted services are that we can look at, maybe containers, maybe AKS, maybe service plans, maybe be managed instances or Azure SQL. Those kinds of things we need to know up front as a part of some of the alignment. And as we get into this workload assessment, we know where we're going to, right? If we're just going from an IaaS to an IaaS, fine. That's not going to be anything out of the ordinary. But if we are transforming or we're modernizing, we need to know where our landing is so that we can drive into this a little bit further and get into a deeper analysis and maybe run tools like a DMA, which is a database migration assessment, which is going to tell you where those blockers are for going to certain service types. One thing I also always like to say is what would 3Cloud do, right? We've got a lot of experience, and we can fast track some of those situational assessments that by workload type, we've got kind of a nice long library of, we see this type of workload, we should do X with it, right? If we see certain maybe backup software that shows up in a scan, we're negating that from having to move it out to Azure because we're going to go take advantage of a backup service that's native to the cloud. File shares are a perfect example of how you would look at that and where you would want to take that, along with Exchange, right? We don't necessarily want to move those workloads as they exist today just for the sake of moving them. It's not a great experience. It has high risk associated with the organization being disrupted on a baseline communication platform like email. There's little appetite for disruption of service. So we'd look at other ways to mitigate that risk and drive our customers towards the right decision. And that's where 3Cloud's experience pays dividends. Moving right along, we've got, as I like to call this, the pre-migration prep. As we get into, a checklist of things that we like to make sure that we're preparing for. One of the things I always like to frame up is when we're moving from one house to another, if we were to move locations, would you bring everything with you? Many cases, likely not, right? We would shed that stuff at the existing house so that we, number one, don't have to spend all that labor to move it, maybe spend the additional cost on additional time of those movers to move it. And so what we can do before we get into an actual migration is make sure that we clean up and we rid the environment of the things that we really don't need to bring with us so that it can save us time as well as consumption cost. I know that that's a no-brainer, but it's something that as you prepare for your data center migrations, you should be looking at that stuff first. Those are opportunities for us to rethink what we really need to bring with us as we start to get into a migration. We want to make sure that we align a point person to run internal and external communications. I shared with everyone earlier that this is a really important piece to a successful migration. This is something that they're going to help keep the pressure off of the delivery team that's executing on this, because we're forward thinking and we're letting everybody know that there may be a disruption of service or whatever it may be, right? Those are opportunities for us to make sure that we're getting out in front of it, and that somebody is also, playing air traffic controller and directing the proper communications at the right levels to the appropriate team members to be involved at the right times. So identify possible migration risks and document them is something that we like to put together a little bit of a risk register. We want a couple items that come to mind, team availability, especially as the holidays are rolling up and we're going to get into a DC migration. Does it make sense to do it during that time, right? Is there going to be a change freeze? Is the team going to be available if something goes sideways? What does that look like, and make sure that that's part of your game plan. Aligning vendors to support the migration if needed, right? So if you've got third-party COTS apps that may require some additional support, let's get them lined up ahead of time. That's a risk that we can mitigate by having it on our register and making sure that we're preparing for what those scenarios might look like. Get operational infrastructure in place ahead of time, right? This is something that when you look at your monitoring and alerting, we know that that's kind of second nature and all that stuff's going to be set up, but making sure that you're aligning to maybe whatever that existing monitoring and alerting is, you're accounting for that with regards to your move, right? If you're going to be taking on new monitoring and alerting, get the groups together, get the notifications together. There's platform notifications that come from Azure that you're not going to necessarily have in your prior life that you need to account for in the new life, right? So let's get those things in place. Let's set up the backups, the policies, the storage. Let's get the disaster recovery vaults in place if those are going to be required for once the workload goes live. We want to forward think where we're headed and where this can really ensure that we're bringing it full circle once we get it to the other side. So those are some of the pre-migration prep checklist items I like to go through. Migration and optimize, right? So this is where we get into the actual migration and some of the post-migration operational activities that align with what I just mentioned around, enabling monitoring and stuff like that, to have it there, have all of the pieces in place to then just flip it on. We want to create a migration plan based on the approach, right? We want to set up a test migration. We want to maybe do just create a VM that has nothing on it and get it through the pipeline without impacting anything, just to make sure that the flow is there. We want to create small wins that create momentum for us. And so targeting, as we're calling out here, targeting lower SDLC environments like dev, test, QA, and working your way closer to prod, that now is an opportunity for us to work out some of those kinks in the lower tier environments before getting to prod, and it gives us a comfort level of we know what we're walking into and what we need to cut over, and then what we need to document as a part of updating that game plan. And that then builds for a much stronger production release as we get into what has the potential to impact customers, right? And we're hitting that from the app side, we're hitting that from the database side, we're hitting that from the networking side, and we're taking strong notes, right? We're making sure that we've got some of our testers in place so that they know what to run through. What are their game plans to make sure that they're going to be able to assist us on migration day to make sure that everything's running where it needs to. These scenarios are critical to the outcomes of the actual production cutover, where you're mitigating the risk for the organization and you're minimizing downtime. Determine online/offline migration. This is something where this gets into play where we maybe have to have a near real-time cutover, where maybe it's almost like a clustered cutover, right? Think of an always-on availability group and swinging over a high-performant database from on-prem out to Azure. That may require us adding an additional node in Azure that is added to the cluster and then promoted, right? And then swinging over the other services in a way that's really kind of a side-by-side that's going to enable us to minimize the amount of downtime if it really needs to be kind of an online migration. There's other tools to assist us as well, the database migration service and other things like that that are going to really help accelerate our path forward. But we need to be mindful of what's required by the business and what's acceptable with regards to downtime or disruption of service, and plan that around appropriate change windows. Post-migration optimization. This gets into really the operational enablement, flipping on all those things that we set up in the last slide with regards to some of the operational pieces, and then also keeping a pulse on this, right? We're gonna have data, runtime data in Azure, and we're gonna be able to see that, okay, well, you know, the systems that we're building in Azure, well, the specs might be the same as far as the virtual CPU versus in the amount of memory. The conversion doesn't always convert to what it was on-prem. Maybe you're working from old hardware with old CPUs and less performant RAM. That is now, you're getting way more performance in the cloud. Let's keep a pulse on that, because after we've got some runtime data, we've got an opportunity to optimize and save additional cost. And so those are things that, or we're running out of juice, right? We need additional capacity. Well, all it is a power down, power up, and you've got all of everything that you're going to need there, or we need to add disk performance. Those are things that we've got to keep a pulse on, and we've got to make sure that we're very mindful of that as we get into kind of real time in the cloud in Azure. This is an example of one of those communication runbooks that I like to highlight as, you know, laying out a game plan with enough detail and accountability is key in this with regards to the alignment, who's doing what. When everybody's looking at the same game plan, you'll see up above in this visual of all of the things that are pre-migration versus when you get to that red line, day of tasks and what time we're starting and who's doing what and what to expect. Those are situations where we create these game plans with our customers to make sure that everybody knows who's where. And that way everybody can contribute and they know when to be expected. This is critical in making sure that a migration goes well. And there's other activities that we've got with regards to kind of a migration runbook that has a lot more of the inventory pieces baked into it, that is going to allow us to keep track of our migration as we work through everything. So snapping over to, okay, we've talked about the process and some of the considerations and some of the ideas there. Well, what kind of tooling is going to really help us tie this all together? And the answer really is Azure Migrate, right? Microsoft has made a huge investment in this, right? It is the tool that ties discovery, assessment, and migration together all in one. And it's got native support for VMware. It's got Hyper-V, which are agentless, which is great. So it doesn't impact us having to install an agent and go through change control in order to get those out there. For bare metal, it does require an agent, as you'd imagine. There needs to be a way to communicate so it can handle, you know, maybe physical boxes that are out there. It allows us to migrate from other clouds, AWS, GCP, even Zen, right? So that would be another hypervisor that we can align to some of what Azure Migrate can help us discover and execute a migration on. It's obviously focused on Microsoft Windows as well as Linux operating systems, and so it's tailored to that, and it obviously has a lot of capabilities there to provide information and data around what's within those environments. Third-party services provide additional capability. This is where it gets into, Microsoft has a bunch of different plugin tools that can help service certain scenarios that you might want to do a certain type of migration with, right? And so this provides an ecosystem that maybe while the native solution doesn't provide it, some of these third-party services can help accomplish some of those migration activities that you might need. So little overview on Azure Migrate. We'll get into a little bit more of it. This is one of the port communications queries that I've used many of times. I would say that this is just a great way to capture port traffic in kind of a CSV format that is going to allow you, so essentially you can use KQL if all the logs are flowing to log analytics. You can use KQL to run this query, and it's going to tell you all the port communications that are coming into a VM. And then it can also break down the processes that are running there, right? And what's nice about this is it's going to give you a detailed list of the port traffic that you can then filter and sort. And you start to see certain services that align to what's your Active Directory and everything else that's flowing through that VM. And you've got it over the course of 10 days, right? So it's pulling this information, and as those communications take place, you literally have a documented this talk to this, and so we know about it and we can review it as a group, and it gives you a nice little capability there. So with that, I'm going to pivot over to what is a quick demo of Azure Migrate and what its capabilities are. So give me 1 second here. I'm going to just swing this over. And so as we're looking at this, I want to make sure that I'm going to ask maybe even just a quick comment. Are you guys able to see the Azure Migrate? Let's see here. There we are. Okay. You guys are seeing this. I'm going to blow this up a little bit so it's a little bit larger. When we get into Azure Migrate within the platform, this is where everything starts, right? So as you get in to set this up, you can go into this Get Started section, and it tells you, kind of launching a project, the Discover, Assess, and Migrate. That can be for a full data center migration. You've also got just databases only, or you can explore other scenarios, right, and other services that you may be able to use. As we look at this, the servers, databases, and web apps, this is where we tend to spend a lot of our time, but this is the databases only. If you're going to use the database migration service, it's really a point and shoot kind of configuration of what you're needing to set up, and it's very well documented on how to navigate each of these situations, right? So VDI, if you need to migrate your VDI up to Azure, it gives you an option here. If you wanted to port over your applications to a web app, there's some capabilities here, and maybe even look at some containerization, right? That's coming into view here. There's also the capability of going down the data box route. If you've got large amounts of data that you don't want to move over VPN or Express route, this would be a situation where you basically can work on setting up your Dropbox configuration and then getting that added. So as we get into kind of the servers and databases, this is where, like I said, we spend the majority of our time. If we get into Discover, right, what I wanted to share here is that we've got options for connecting into the different types of hypervisors that we may be using. Most cases, it's VMware or Hyper-V. And when you do that, right, this is going to give you something, or it's essentially going to allow you to download an OVA, which is about a 12 gig OVA, last I checked on this. And really, you're going to pull that down and you're going to import it into your vCenter, and you're going to be able to manage this and really get the wheels in motion very quickly to start to discover your environment. And it really is going to take you through all of this step by step in a way that's really easy to manage. Now, as you start to get into some of the the outputs, right? So once that all is in play, you're going to have visibility into some of that dependency analysis that allows you to help group workloads together. I don't have this set up on an existing system right now. Otherwise, it would be populating and providing some of that initial data that comes through after about 15 minutes for the initial scan. And I mean, within a couple hours, you literally can have a nice overview of what's in your environment, what's compatible, what's the recommended sizes. Obviously, you want that to run over time so that we catch peak times. But this tool provides a lot of capability with regards to just kind of assessing the environment first. The second part of this is you get into the actual server migration. This now allows you to chart this into or map it to where you're going to place it within Azure if you're bringing these over as VMs, right? So as we get into that scenario, you're really mapping this to the foundational pieces that you've built out, preferably in a hub and spoke topology within your environment. And from there, it gives an opportunity for us to begin that migration process and to run some tests and start to swing workloads out and accelerate that path forward of getting the migration underway from an IaaS perspective. As we get into some of those other pieces with regards to PaaS services, there's more analysis around the database. There's more analysis around kind of a code level scan that we need to get into, and some of the authentication pieces that are part of the application. But those tend to have a longer time frame for them. We absolutely have the capabilities to help guide some of those discussions, but it usually starts with an initial assessment to understand where the blockers are, and for us to help our customers work through those remediations in a timely manner so that they can start to realize the benefits of the cloud as quickly as possible. So we've seen it all on this end. You know, it's always an experience with regards to working through migration, but getting through those first couple workloads as you break them out into kind of a wave migration and grouped together, if you want to call migration groups, it really affords the opportunity for us to move in a controlled manner instead of having to do everything in a big bang. And it really smooths out some of that risk that a big bang scenario would potentially present. So if a big bang is required, obviously there's a lot more that goes around that, and we have worked through those scenarios, but I advise against it where possible, and you start to piece out the items that are going to help build out the environment in a way that's going to really mitigate your risk as you go. So that said, I mean, that takes me through my presentation here. I'm gonna pause for a second and see if there's any questions that are out there that I can help answer.
We don't currently have any questions, Joe. I don't know if anybody wants to put one in before we end the session.
All right. Any questions for me? I'm not sure if I'm seeing those in chat. It looks like it's fairly quiet. I really appreciate everybody jumping on today to participate in the discussion. From here, I think we're good to go. Everybody have a great rest of the day, and enjoy the holidays. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.